So most of you watching this video and those who subscribe to my channel will probably want Bernie Sanders to become president, and if not Bernie Sanders, they would probably like someone who's a lot like him. But I wanted to take this time to talk about what a first term of a Bernie Sanders presidency would look like. So we're thinking very far ahead, and we're assuming that he wins the nomination, and we're assuming he wins the whole, election and everything. But I want to get into, what can we expect, and maybe not to get overexcited about what he can achieve and everything. So during my undergrad, I wrote my dissertation on President Jimmy Carter, and in particular, I looked at his foreign policy. And what is quite interesting with Jimmy Carter is, although he tried to be anti-interventionist, and he was pretty successful in a lot of regards, but at the same time, what America is and all the special interests and everything it's involved in and all the alliances it has, it's kind of hard to really back away from all those things, because once you get into office, I think people realise the reality of the presidency, and I don't think that gives an excuse for people like President Obama to, basically fundamentally change everything he says, during his campaign, things like closing down Guantanamo Bay and kind of moving away from the war on terror. He didn't do that, and I don't think it's an excuse to say, well, the reality of America and the presidency hit me. But at the same time, when, you research something in depth and you take someone like Jimmy Carter, who was so different to most US presidents, and I think you just got to realise what might be facing Bernie when he becomes president. Because although Jimmy Carter was successful in getting peace between Egypt and Israel, which is a massive, massive deal, and not really invading Iran when he had an excuse to and everything, or other things like when Nicaragua became socialist and he didn't intervene, and we see what Ronald Reagan did later in regards to that country, the whole Iran-Contra controversy and everything. But he still had some scandals, like, for example, people talking about East Timor, people talk about El Salvador and everything, and, you have to agree he did mess up on these things. And what is interesting is that in his presidential autobiography, he doesn't even talk about El Salvador, because the whole thing with Archbishop Romero being killed and assassinated by the US-backed government either played with his mind, or he just didn't really want to talk about it. So let's stick with the topic of foreign policy for a moment, and let's go with how Bernie Sanders may approach foreign policy when he becomes president. So I'm going to really focus on a couple of issues, but in the more broader sense, what do we expect from Bernie Sanders? Throughout Bernie Sanders' career and his life, he's been against many US wars, including the war in Vietnam, including the war in Iraq, and he was for the invasion of Afghanistan, but not for the occupation of Afghanistan. So he's pretty consistent in that he's an anti-interventionist, sort of like Jimmy Carter, and sort of like a lot of other candidates in the field and everything. Like, for example, Tulsi Gabbard and some others. So that is generally what we can expect. I wouldn't expect, Bernie Sanders to launch the US into a new war, whether that be in Iran, Venezuela, Syria, or, over China or something like that. If people watch my video on Taiwan and how that could cause World War III, do I think Bernie Sanders would launch, an attack on China if they invaded Taiwan? I really doubt it, but he'd also get savaged by the media and by the people for not doing that, so it's a hard one. So in regards to Syria, I think it's pretty clear he's against US involvement there, and what does that really mean? I guess that's really pulling US troops out of Syria. That's what you'd expect from a Bernie Sanders presidency. You would think he wouldn't want to be involved in this conflict any longer. But at the same time, I'm quite skeptical, not because of who he is, but because of what the US is. And, the Bernie Sanders administration is not just going to be him. So can he do that? Will he be able to just be like, right, everyone, out you go, no more US troops in Syria? Because people have to realise, as someone myself who's done international relations for my master's degree and everything, and I really subscribe to the realist view of the world, is that there aren't any morals, and it's all basically a chess game. And at the end of the day, that's how you can rationalise the US being in these places where Russia and China operate. So for example, why the US might be in Syria at the moment is because they don't want Russia gaining a massive foothold in that part of the world, and that's how it's like a chess game, and they see themselves as like the better option, and it's all about their own power as well. So that's what I'm really skeptical of. Bernie Sanders, everything he said, you'd think he'd pull troops out of Syria, he'd stop most action in places like that, airstrikes and the like, and he'd really cut back on the drone program and everything to do with the war on terror. You'd expect that, and I hope that would happen. But at the same time, from someone who studied Jimmy Carter's foreign policy extensively, it seems you cannot completely back away from what America is. So for example, while Bernie might be able to do certain things like Carter did, I don't think he will be able to fundamentally change the US relationship with the world. But, you know, a lot of people, we will expect that he will stop intervening in countries like Syria. But at the same time, that leaves them open to be more influenced by Iran and Russia. Will there be people in his administration who won't tolerate that? And that's just an interesting question to think about. You know, in terms of Venezuela, I see some people quite angry at Bernie for kind of towing the line about, you know, Maduro and everything like that. But Bernie knows that sanctions don't usually hurt the elites and the corrupt authoritarian regimes in these countries. They normally help kill loads and loads of poor people who cannot get access to things like food and clean water. And it happened in Iraq in the 1990s. The sanctions did nothing to deter Saddam Hussein, really. It just killed a load of poor people. So we hope Bernie will really not support further sanctions against places like Venezuela or North Korea, because in a lot of ways it never really affects the elite in these countries. Like I said, it just kills more people, and especially the poor. It's the poor who suffer from these sanctions. And sanctions may have their place in countries that are wealthier and everything, and maybe do have an alternative politically, but in countries so poor like Venezuela and North Korea, it's not going to help anything. And in countries that are so controlled by the state and everything, I don't think sanctions are really going to change anything in those countries. And I hope Bernie, you know, he said it in the past, but I hope he doesn't put more sanctions on places like Venezuela. And just staying on the topic of Latin America, let's hope he also improves relations with Cuba. You know, in the past he has had many positive things to say about Fidel Castro and the Marxist revolution there. Not completely like glowing and everything, but when he was younger he talked about, you know, being influenced by that and everything. So let's hope he goes out of his way to normalize relations with Cuba, because it's totally insane the US still hasn't, you know, made relations at normal and stopped this stupid embargo on Cuba, even though Obama took steps to do that. Let's hope when Bernie comes in, that's an easy win for him. Just, you know, make relations between the US and Cuba normal. So now let's go to Iran. So obviously Trump ripped up the Iran nuclear deal that was established by China, Russia, the UK, France and the US to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons and really stop them from using nuclear power altogether, so they can't one day develop nuclear weapons. And Iran went along with this, and it was a great success to stop them from getting nukes. But then Trump for some reason just tore it up, because probably what has happened is that the neocons in his administration want to invade Iran because they want to set up a US-backed government there and hopefully, you know, get access to Iranian oil, because it has some of the biggest oil reserves in the world, just like Venezuela does. So it's not really hard to see why Trump doesn't like Iran. But Bernie Sanders has been super critical of this. So let's hope maybe there's something where if Bernie became president, he would make relations with Iran better, and hopefully there's some way he can rejoin this deal, because it is a good deal and it's only holding at the moment because everyone else is upholding it and not going along with Trump. So let's hope that happens. And what Trump is saying is that because Iran is still active in the region, that's why he ripped up. But that's total bullshit, because that's not part of the deal. Iran selling weapons to various groups, or Iran building ballistic missile technology, isn't relevant to the nuclear deal. So it was total bullshit to rip it up for that reason. So while we're on the topic of Iran, let's go to Saudi Arabia. So essentially the Trump administration are trying to give a country that is so backwards, it basically follows a medieval interpretation of Islam. They want to give them nuclear weapons, and that is utterly insane. And it's crazy how in bed the Trump administration is with the Saudis, and how in bed the US has been with them since the 1930s and everything. So hopefully Bernie Sanders, I would like him to put loads of pressure on them to change things if they want to have an alliance with the US. In an ideal world, I would hope they would cut all ties with Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, I'm thinking in my international relations sort of brain, Saudi Arabia is making increasing deals with places like Russia for military technology. Would you rather the Saudis be in bed with the Russians and China, or would you rather have some sort of influence on them? So, you know, what will Bernie do there? I'm not too sure, but of course he's going to call them out more for their human rights. He's been pushing to end the war in Yemen, you know, bringing stuff to votes and everything. So hopefully he does something more about Saudi Arabia, and I'm hopeful that is an area he will be successful in, because I think there is a lot of support, especially on the left, for changing this relationship with Saudi Arabia. So to end the foreign policy segment, let's end on North Korea and China. So Bernie's approach to North Korea will hopefully be a lot more nuanced than Donald Trump. You know, I hope Bernie's not going to call Kim a great guy and everything, but hopefully maybe an approach that will maybe put us on the path to North Korea getting rid of their nuclear weapons, you know, relieving the sanctions a bit for its people is obviously a big deal. But at the same time, it's a very complicated issue, and obviously North Korea is such a danger to the world. We'd love it all if North Korea got rid of their nukes, but at the same time, China really like North Korea. being like a wild dog they have, you know, in their back pocket with nuclear weapons is helpful for their foreign policy. And it's just so complicated because it's such an entrenched dictatorship with such a large army, such a big military arsenal. How do you really deal with that? And is there a way to deal with that, like, effectively? I guess, you know, you could use sanctions, but you can't really incite such an impoverished people who are under the thumb of this dictator in such a big way to really revolt and get rid of him. That's one part of sanctions, is that you put so much pressure on the population to take action and get rid of their oppressive dictator. But in this instance, I don't know if that could really happen. But we'll see. It will definitely need a more nuanced approach than Donald Trump is doing right now. Now, in terms of China, they're obviously going to be one of the biggest challenges for Bernie Sanders because they're going to be expanding in this period. You know, Bernie will be president between 2021 and 2025. China will keep rising. And like I made a video before, what would President Bernie Sanders do if China invaded Taiwan? Would he respond? But also because people have this expectation on Bernie Sanders that he's an anti-interventionist, and they wouldn't want him to do it. But at the same time, these two superpowers are going to be going at it for the next 50 years to see who will come out on top. And will the US people or the US Congress and all the special interests really allow a man like Bernie Sanders to get away with doing nothing? And I think that is a big, big point. And again, thinking in a more theoretical context, it's like a chess game. And I think people might be disappointed with what Sanders may become because it's just such a hard decision. You know, on the surface, you can be this anti-interventionist person saying that in politics and everything, but when it comes down to it, you're the president. What do you do in this instance? And I think it's very hard, and I think it's an area where a lot of presidents don't get a lot of slack because sometimes it's just such a high-risk situation. Many of us could not imagine being in that position to make the decisions, and I think, you know, that's something that gets lost on the left a lot of the time. We like to vilify every president as a monster. You know, Obama's a monster, Jimmy Carter's a monster, Harry Truman's a monster, FDR's a monster. They're all war criminals and stuff like that. But at the same time, there's obviously lots of criticism for people like Obama. You know, the war on terror is pretty needless, isn't it? Like drone striking weddings and shit, having Guantanamo Bay open, that is legit criticism. But at the same time, in the Cold War, for example, Jimmy Carter backing these dictators, you know, what does he do in this international chess game? Does he just let the Soviet Union take over these places for themselves? And it's a really, really hard question. And I think, in terms of foreign policy, I think people may be very disappointed with Bernie Sanders in the end, because while he might fundamentally change a lot of things, I think the US is just like this massive monolithic thing where you cannot change the path it's on. There's too many interests, there's too many jobs, there's too much pressure, there's too much everything. You can't slow down the direction the US is going, and you can't fundamentally change it. The US will never become isolationist. And even if Trump was honest about his isolationist rhetoric, he probably found it was a similar situation, but he wasn't honest, so we won't get into that because we know Trump was never gonna be so inward looking for the US. He just said it because he knew it was popular. So yeah, much like Jimmy Carter, I think Bernie Sanders may have some political success in the foreign sphere, but I think people should probably calm down and not expect too much and not hold him like so accountable for everything, because the US, I think, is just this entity that you can't fundamentally change at this point. And I think his successes will mainly be domestic, and it will kind of take away from the US being in many ways during his administration business as usual, because I think that is what will happen. So yeah, hopefully some successes, change some alliances for the better, stop stuff like the drone program and everything. Yeah, that's great, but you know, when it comes to China, North Korea, lots of issues with Russia as well and everything, I don't expect too much from him, and I don't expect him to be too much different from every other president before him. So let's get to domestic issues, and I want to focus on a couple. So for example, the big one is probably healthcare. You know, so Bernie Sanders has been pushing for a British, European, Scandinavian style healthcare system for about 30 years. You know, it's where it's funded by a special tax and just general taxes, and you will pay into a system, meaning everyone has coverage, and if you need healthcare, you will get it. And the Koch brothers' own study found that is actually a cheaper way of doing healthcare. But at the same time, there's going to be a lot of pushback, not just from Republicans, but from a lot of Democrats. You know, a lot of presidential candidates are walking back their proposals for Medicare for all and everything. And, you know, corporations essentially rule politics in America. So you can expect the corporations are going to fight back. So things like Big Pharma and everything, they're going to fight Bernie Sanders on this issue. But hopefully the people make it clear that with the election of Bernie Sanders, this is what they want. And what I also hope is if Sanders can't get it done in his first 2 years, people should start primarying Democrats who don't go along with it and who are obvious corporate hacks. And I know there's been a bit of backlash against people like AOC, but that is really the future if you want to fundamentally change this system. So, you know, I'm optimistic Bernie can get something done. The US is so backwards in this regard. You know, we will have to see, because corporate money rules politics. And that is another thing Bernie needs to focus on as well, is getting money out of politics, you know, and a constitutional amendment, hopefully, you know, things like the Young Turks have been doing with their Wolf Pack organisation. And that is something Bernie needs to tackle, because so many problems in America are rooted in the corporate ruling of your politics, whether that is, you know, the war on drugs, whether that is private prisons, whether that is mass shootings, whether that is, you know, pretty much anything, healthcare. Everything is linked to these corporate interest groups ruling your politics and owning your politicians. And it also comes to play in foreign policy, like you see with APAC and things like that as well. But that is what Bernie needs to do to make the US an actual democracy again, because at this point it is essentially an oligarchy with democratic elements, because people don't really have a voice in America anymore, because you're just owned by corporations, and because people are generally ill-informed and not very well educated, they will keep voting in Republicans and Democrats who essentially stand for nothing and will do their corporate masters' bidding. And that sounds pretty dramatic, but you know it's true at this point, because how can a country like mine get the NHS in 1948? But how can the richest country of all time have a massive pushback against introducing a similar system to their own country, you know? It sounds pretty insane, and most of the developed world and even poorer countries have adopted this system, like Cuba, for example, but the US seemingly is exempt from it. Or would it be that the US's politics is so bought by the pharmaceutical industry that that's why they aren't doing anything about this? So a final point is that Bernie Sanders is obviously massive on environmental issues, so he would probably tackle climate change in a big way. And this is also a foreign policy issue, but I think it starts in the domestic sphere. So you have people like AOC and Bernie pushing for the Green New Deal, where they're trying to revolutionise the US economy to make it less reliant on fossil fuels and things like that, and change it to a more green economy. You know, things like wind turbines that apparently cause cancer, according to your president. And, you know, just generally diversifying the economy so that in the future it won't lead to, you know, mass people being laid off because coal has stopped being used, or coal has ran out, or oil isn't being used as much. And hopefully it will retrain people to work in other industries that will be sustainable for the future. Now, this is a bit of pie in the sky thinking and everything, and people like Andrew Yang have sort of called this out, and they're like, you know, it's so hard to retrain people for jobs. I think he pointed to a stat that most people never get retrained properly for like a job that is so different. But you got to start somewhere, and the US is the second biggest polluter in the world, and if it doesn't change its ways, you know, the world as we know it is going to end essentially. And what people don't realise is, although the US might be okay in a lot of instances, you know, some land might go away and they have more drought and stuff, but what will happen is there'll be more wars in the world over resources and everything, which will, you know, eventually affect the US, because places where they get a lot of products from, whether that be in Asia or Africa, will be in a state of war, and that will have a knock-on effect on the US economy as well. So the US and China are the two big ones that fundamentally have to change. And it's also in Bernie to stop the corporations exploiting the US to pollute so much, because 100 corporations contribute to 75% of CO2 emissions, which is pretty crazy. A lot of them are American corporations, but at the same time, it all plays back to this thing of money in politics. So obviously this is such a massive topic. I could go through, you know, every single country in terms of foreign policy, or I could go through every kind of domestic issue, but these are the ones I wanted to focus on. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. What do you think a potential first term of Bernie Sanders' presidency would look like? Tell me about issues that I haven't covered you think are important. There's things like ending the war on drugs and, you know, mass shootings that I didn't cover in depth and everything. But leave in the comments what you think is important as well. If you like this video, leave a like. Please subscribe to the channel if you're new. Maybe also share this video with someone you think might like it. You can follow me on social media on both Instagram and Twitter at The Tabernacle. I also have a WordPress blog where I write about various issues, so check that out as well. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.